Kita amat bertuah pada pagi ini kerana yang berbahagia Dr. Chandra Muzaffar, pengerusi Yayasan 1 Malaysia, akan menyampaikan ceramah beliau bertajuk Strengthening Unity Through Integrity in Multi-Religious Society. Yang berhormat Datuk dan hadirin sekalian, allow me to read yang berbahagia Dr. Chandra's biodata. Yang berbahagia Dr. Chandra Muzaffar is the Chairman of the Board of Trustees of the One Malaysia Foundation, an independent and non-profit organization established in July 2009. Yang berbahagia Dr. Chandra is also the President of the International Movement for a Just World. He has published extensively on civilizational dialogue, international politics, religion, human rights, and Malaysian society. The author and editor of 29 books in English and Malay, and yang berbahagia Dr. Chandra's latest publications include 2 e-books, namely A World in Crisis, Is There a Cure? And Withawana, Reflection of the Arab Uprisings. In 1977, he founded a multi-ethnic social reform group called Aliran Kesedaran Negara, or Aliran, which he led for 14 years. Today, apart from his role in Yayasan 1 Malaysia, yang berbahagia Dr. Chandra sits on the board of a number of international NGOs and concerned with social justice and civilizational dialogue. Yang berbahagia Dr. Chandra was a professor and director of the Center for Civilizational Dialogue, University of Malaya from 1997 to 1999, and professor of Global Studies at University Science Malaysia from 2007 to 2012. Without further ado, may I invite Yang berbahagia Dr. Chandra Muzaffar to deliver his talk, please.
Seorang yang berhormat Datuk Taib Zulkifli, Dev yang terhormat, para hadirin yang budiman, Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Salam sejahtera, peace be with you. Ribuan terima kasih atas jemputan ini. Saya merasa bangga sekali lagi di Kuching, Bandar Raya Perpaduan yang diisytiharkan pada 1 hari bulan Ogos 2015 ni. Tajuk ucapan saya pagi ini adalah tentang integriti dalam konteks perpaduan. Saya diminta menyampaikan ucapan ini dalam bahasa Inggeris, tetapi dalam kita punya sesi interaksi, saudara-saudara boleh memukakan soalan dalam bahasa Inggeris ataupun bahasa Malaysia. What is integrity? What is integrity? Integrity is uprightness. It is honesty, it is sincerity, it is trustworthiness. Integrity in our national language is perhaps amanah, though there is no exact translation for integrity. But the closest that we can think of is amanah. Integrity is amanah, linked to trustworthiness. Friends, why is integrity linked to unity? What is the connection between integrity and unity? There are perhaps 2 links between integrity and unity. Integrity is a virtue in almost every religion and culture, without exception. It is a virtue. It is regarded as a highly cherished value in every religion and culture, as I'll explain in a while. That's the first link between integrity and unity. The second link is deeper. When there is integrity in a society, when there is integrity at the apex of a society, among the people at the top of a society, you will find that it's much easier to bring people together, to unite people across socio-economic divides, to unite them across ethnic and religious divides, to unite them across territorial divides. It is much easier to unite them when there's integrity, especially at the top. Why? Because integrity fosters trust. It generates trust. When there's integrity at the top, there's trust between the leaders and the led, and between the different segments of society. Among the different communities, there's trust, because there is integrity. And that trust keeps a society together. It unites a society, which is why integrity, because it generates trust, it is able to act as the glue for society, the cement that strengthens the bond within society. This is why integrity is very important for unity. Friends, I said a while ago that integrity is a cherished value in all the religions, without exception. In Islam, for instance, the whole purpose of human existence is linked to integrity. Why? Because the creation of the human being is to fulfill a trust. It is to fulfill God's trust. That's the whole purpose of creation, to fulfill one's trust, to live according to certain values and principles which God intends for all of us as human beings. That's the trust. That is the amana. That is that aspect that we call integrity. You will find that in the Quran, the commitment to integrity is not just found in the story about the creation of the human being, because it's so clear. Allah asks the mountains, Allah asks other creations before the human being to take up this trust. And no one is prepared to take up this trust. In the end, it is the human being that takes up this trust. It is a trust. It is an amana. But it's not just in the creation story that integrity is emphasized. As I said, it is the essence of the whole of human existence. And one of the wrongdoings that goes against integrity, which the Quran mentions specifically, one of the acts that human beings are capable of that goes against integrity is, of course, corruption. It is corruption. Corruption goes against integrity. In 2 places in the Quran, corruption is mentioned directly, specifically. One is in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 188, where we are warned not to bribe judges, not to bribe those who have to make decisions, which in the broad sense includes a lot of people, administrators, politicians, not just judges. That is in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 188. Then in Surah An-Nisa, verse 10, we are told that when we are entrusted with the welfare of orphans, we must fulfill our trust. We must never ever betray our trust. So it is not just looking after orphans, it is looking after anyone. Whenever you're given the responsibility, you should never ever betray your trust. And that again is very specific. If you try to betray your trust, you do something that is wrong, when you have been given a trust, then it is something that is against Allah. It is against the Quran. And there are many examples, as I'm sure you're aware of, both Muslims and non-Muslims, in Muslim history, of caliphs who lived up to these high standards set by the Quran and by the Prophet. You have the example of the second caliph, Sayyidina Umar ibn Khattab. He was so committed to integrity that even when it came to getting a little bit of olive oil that was kept in the treasury, the Baitul Mal, for his own illness because he was sick and he had to take that olive oil, he got permission from the people because the Baitul Mal was the treasury for the people. That was the notion of integrity. When his own follower asked him about the baju that he was wearing, because he was a huge person, and that follower told him, look, on the basis of the ration that you yourself instituted, every person so much cloth, because at that time there was a famine in that part of Arabia. Every person only entitled to so much cloth. How could you have made that baju for yourself because of your size? And he replied to his follower, he said, you're right. I borrowed another piece of cloth from my own son, the cloth that was assigned to him in order to make this baju. That was his idea of integrity. Everything one had to be accountable for. You had to be transparent. So it is not something that has come from the West. This is not something which is just modern. It has been there for a long, long time. The principle of accountability and transparency. A number of other examples. You know the fourth caliph, Sayyidina Ali ibn Talib? In his famous letter to his governor, Malik Ashtar, the governor that he appointed to look after Egypt. At that time, the Muslim empire had expanded. Ali, in that famous letter to Malik Ashtar, he advised him about how he should look after the people of Egypt. One of the first principles, he said, is ensure that there is no corruption. Make sure that there is integrity of the highest order, because that is your trust, your responsibility. Don't favor your own relatives. Don't just look after your friends and neglect the people. And this was more than 1,400 years ago. So the principle of accountability is very, very strong in Islam. I'm very fond of telling this story of yet another caliph, the Umayyad caliph by the name of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz. He was caliph for only 2.5 years, for a very short while. He was killed. He was a man of tremendous integrity. When he was appointed caliph, he went back to his house weeping. And his wife asked him, why are you weeping? And he said, now the people in this whole empire have become my responsibility. I don't know whether I can look after the widows and the orphans and the poor and the destitute, because they have become my trust. And he saw that as something which was a very, very heavy burden. Nowadays, you find that when people are given a certain position, they celebrate. They think, that's their right. They're so happy about it. But this great caliph was different. For him, it was a responsibility, a trust. Now, it is the same caliph who was so concerned about what was private, what was public. He made a very clear distinction between the two. So much so that one night, when he was in his own kamar, his own room, and he was looking at some documents, his nephew came in. And the nephew wanted to discuss something with his uncle. And the caliph, the uncle, asked the nephew, "What is it that you want to talk to me about?" He said, "It is a family matter." And this caliph, very quickly, he put out the light from the candle. He just snuffed out the candle. And they were in darkness. And the nephew asked him, "Why did you do this? We are now in darkness." And he said, "Well, you see, the candle is a candle that was given to me by the government to look at government documents. Now you have come in, you want to discuss something about the family. I have no right to use this candle." This is extraordinary. But this was how he separated what was public, what was part of his duty as a head of state, and from what is private. Now, it is this principle that is very, very important in governance. Very important in governance, which many of us tend to put aside. We don't really pay attention to things like this. But these are important principles. I can go on, and I will not want to do that. But let me emphasize this. You will find these values and principles in all the different traditions. I'm very impressed by how strong this principle of integrity is in Christianity. Many of you would be aware of this. If you look at the lives of the Benedictine monks, of someone like St. Francis of Assisi, about honesty and integrity in his life, or if you look at other orders within the Christian faith, whether it is the Sisters of the Poor or the Trappist monks and so on, integrity was very, very important to their lives. Leading honest, sincere, simple, humble lives. So fundamental to the Christian faith. Likewise with Confucianism. Being upright was the most important characteristic of an emperor, according to the teachings of Confucius. And you know how Confucius described the corrupt? How he described the corrupt in his own writings thousands of years ago. He called the corrupt lowly pickpockets. Lowly pickpockets. That was his description of the corrupt among officials at that time. And that was also the way in which his disciple, Mengzi, the famous disciple Mengzi, the way in which he looked at corruption. He said, this is utter debasement of the human being to be corrupt. And you had many examples in Chinese history. China has a very long and illustrious history. 200 years before the birth of Christ, the Emperor Wen, he spent his entire stewardship, his period as an emperor, fighting corruption. There was yet another example from the 11th century, a famous Chinese statesman by the name of Wang Anshe. He was a prime minister who was very strong in fighting corruption, so much so that his own brother, who was not as upright as Wang Anshe, the prime minister, he decided to poison him and kill him because of the man's integrity. You had the famous example, which was part of a television series, of the Sung judge, an emperor during the Sung period. The judge during the Sung period, whose name was Judge Po, well known for fighting against corruption, a judge during the period of the Sung emperor. And many other examples. From Hinduism, you find that the whole basis of Hindu philosophy, dharma, is about righteous living. Righteous living. And you've got numerous scriptures in Hinduism. These are called the Dharma Shastras. They're all about righteous living. Very, very important in Hinduism. One of the most famous books about governance, written 300 120 years before the birth of Christ, during the time of the Emperor Chandra Gupta. This was written by a prime minister by the name of Kautilya. The book was called the Artha Shastra. The Artha Shastra was about governing according to principles. And one of the very important principles he stressed was integrity. Integrity, vital in governance. And he gave numerous examples of how corruption takes place, why it is a vice, and how we should fight this vice. It is a very famous book called the Artha Shastra. So, if you look at all the different religious traditions, we have a number of examples. And yet, friends, right through history, people who are religious have also been corrupt. This is a fact. We can't run away from it. People who know their religion, who are religious in terms of the rituals, they do the prayers and they fast, they go to all the holy places, they do the pilgrimages. In all the religions, without exception, you find that people who are religious are also corrupt. What is the reason for this? Why does this happen? It is because of self-interest. It is because of self-interest. Human beings succumb to corruption. Human beings fail to live up to integrity because of self-interest. Right through history, this has been the case. Now, when you think back about it, whether it is in Christianity or in Islam, you look back at the story of Adam and Eve. It is, in the end, about self-interest. You fall because of self-interest. You want something which you are not supposed to have, but you try to get it, and in the end, you fall. So self-interest is a major factor. Why people are not able to live up to integrity, even though integrity is part of their religion, it is part of their culture. This is something that we have to keep in mind. This is why, friends, we cannot fight corruption, we cannot fight wrongdoings, abuse of power, simply by talking about it. Simply by telling ourselves, well, it is in our religions are against corruption, it is not enough. You have to actually educate people. You have to have mass education, not only through schools and universities, but also through the media, through cultural and religious institutions. You have to educate people, make them aware, raise their consciousness. You have to do it through the family, because the family is a very important institution for education. Parents should set the right example. Father, mother, grandparents, we have this responsibility of setting the right example. And this is where many of us fail. Whether it is at the level of the family or through the school, the university, institutions, in society, the media, we are not able to live up to these standards. But education is one way of reminding ourselves, making us aware, raising our consciousness. But that alone is not enough, friends. You cannot bring about an ethical society, a society which is committed to integrity, mere through education. It is not possible. You need laws. You need laws. Because human beings have a tendency to go against what is right, to succumb to their self-interest. So you need laws to correct human behavior. You need laws like a law that will make the Anti-Corruption Commission totally independent of the executive, independent of all other institutions. It must have its own powers. It must be able to do what it wants, prosecute people, act against those who have gone wrong. You must make sure that your anti-corruption agency or commission is independent. You also need a law in society that will require those who have been elected, in the context of Malaysia, whether it is at the state level or at the federal level, those who have been elected should be required by law to declare their assets and liabilities to the people. Maybe through a mechanism linked to the Anti-Corruption Commission or some other mechanism, but declare assets and liabilities to the people, upgrade your records every 1 or 2 years. That should be made compulsory by law. It has been proposed many times, and it's being done in some ways in certain states. Yet another law that we need is, we need a law that will prohibit the close relatives of anyone who is in power, whether it is the Prime Minister or ministers, deputy ministers, chief ministers, Mantri Basars, it doesn't matter who it is. Their close relatives, immediate relatives, should be prohibited by law from bidding for contracts and projects when their relative is in power. It is something that should be prohibited. It is done in some countries. You cannot, as long as the person is in power, very close relatives will not be allowed to bid for contracts and for projects from the state. This has to be done. There's a price to be paid. You want power, there's a price to be paid. Yet another law that we need in this country, which I think is very important, is we have to have a law that will discourage agents, facilitators, and middlemen who have become so commonplace in the Malaysian economy and society. It is just amazing. Almost everything you can think of, any procurement, there is some middleman somewhere. I'm sure you know this. And this is something which we should discourage, because it leads to corruption. It leads to increased costs. And in the end, the consumer suffers. You want to buy a certain pharmaceutical product, there is a middleman somewhere. You want to organize some sort of project for training sportsmen and sportswomen in our country. Instead of doing it directly, you find that there's some middleman somewhere who gets a big cut, a commission. This has become so commonplace in Malaysia. It is very difficult to root out this practice, but it must be done if we want to have a society which has integrity. Yet another thing that we should do, which we're beginning to do, we have to make sure that all contracts are based upon the open tender system. Open tender system, except for certain contracts which, because of defense and security needs, you cannot have an open tender. Nowhere in the world are certain defense contracts part of an open tender system. Now that we understand. But everything else that you want to procure, that you want to purchase, it should be through an open tender, and it should be genuine open tender without some sort of backdoor deal. Now these are things that have to change. Not only in Malaysia, in many parts of the world. If you want to have integrity, we have to have laws which are effective. And these are some of the laws which one should think about in order to bring about integrity. We also need, friends, a free media. In order to fight for a society which is ethical, that has integrity, you need a free media. A media that will report without fear or favor. A media that is not beholden to either political leaders or to bureaucrats or to big business or even to small business. Genuinely independent, autonomous media. Today, with citizens journalism, with the alternative media, you find things a bit better. But nonetheless, we must fight for a genuinely free media as part of our struggle to establish an ethical society. There's something else that we have to do. We have to make sure that if we want to have an ethical society, friends, the gap between rich and poor, between those who are right at the top, the very, very wealthy, and the very, very poor, that gap has to be narrow. It is very significant that it's only in societies where you don't have that gap, where there is equity, where there is a degree of egalitarianism, you'll find in those societies corruption is much, much less, like the Scandinavian countries. Why? Because there is equitable distribution of wealth and resources and opportunities. So you must make sure there is equity and justice. Close the gap between rich and poor. Unfortunately, in Malaysia, since the 1990s, the gap between rich and poor, especially in urban areas, has been getting wider and wider. We have to narrow that if you want to have an ethical society and if you want to uphold integrity. And we must also do something else, friends. We have to make sure that you don't have elites who are so extravagant in their lifestyles, lavish, extravagant in their lifestyles, who are opulent, because that has a very negative impact upon society, and it encourages others to be corrupt, because they too want to follow that sort of lifestyle. They too decide to do wrong things. So that is something that we must discourage. Opulence, extravagance, lavishness on the part of the elite, which again you will find in all religions. This is discouraged. And this brings me to my conclusion. In the ultimate analysis, dear friends, you will have a society that upholds integrity, that is united, where everyone trusts one another, where you don't have this division in society. If there is a total collective consciousness, that is what is important. That society as a whole, part of their collective consciousness, they know that it is wrong to steal from the people. It is wrong to take something that is not yours. It is wrong to cheat. It is wrong to indulge in bad practices, in corruption. It becomes automatic. It becomes instinctive. You won't do it because you know it is wrong. Like the way it is in Japan. In Japan, not in relation to corruption, because in Japan too you have corruption, but when it comes to observing traffic rules, you find that the Japanese, they don't need rules that tell you that you cannot speed beyond, say, 120 kilometers an hour. It is automatic in them. It has become part of their culture. Or in the case of Muslims in Malaysia, it is automatic. It is in their culture, in their total being. They don't consume pork. You don't need a law to tell Muslims you don't consume pork. They know it is wrong. They don't consume pork. But it's a bit different when it comes to corruption. That is the problem. And it's the same thing with the other religious communities. The Christians, their love for Jesus, which is a beautiful thing, it is automatic, it's instinctive, it is in them. Likewise, in the case of the Chinese and the Hindus, they have things which have become part of their total being. That is what we call their collective consciousness, their collective awareness. It is very deep in them. Once a society reaches that level where your abhorrence, your repugnance, your feeling of aversion towards corruption is so strong, you will never do it. You will never do it. And if you do it, it is out of the ordinary. And you know that you will suffer for it because you've done something which is very, very wrong. We haven't reached that point. But there are many people who are trying, who are concerned about integrity. They want to bring about changes, and we hope that changes will come about. And we hope that one day, with the blessings of God, we will have a society which is truly ethical, upright, and committed to integrity in the real sense. Thank you very much.
Terima kasih Yang Berbahagia Dr. Chandra Muzaffar atas ceramah integriti itu tadi, dan dipohon untuk terus berada di atas pentas bagi upacara seterusnya. Majlis dengan segala hormatnya ingin menjemput Yang Berbahagia Tuan Haji Sudirman Haji Aini, Pengurus Besar SEDC, untuk mempersilakan Yang Berhormat Datuk Haji Talib Zubli. Sekiranya ada hadirin sekalian ingin bertanya soalan kepada Yang Berbahagia Profesor Dr. Chandra, dipersilakan untuk ke depan dan bertanya soalan secara terus kepada Yang Berbahagia Profesor. Silakan Ibu Mak Datuk bertanya.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you very much for your talk. I'm sure we enjoy. I'm not going to dominate this. Anybody who wants to ask question, I'll pass the microphone to you. Anyone? Or you want me to start? Okay. I think, well, I have a simple question, probably in the minds of many people. Are we winning the battle against corruption, or is it getting worse? Your opinions, sir?
Sorry, Datuk, kalau boleh.
Sekali lagi, Datuk.
Yeah, I didn't get the last part.
In your opinion or observation, are we winning the battle against corruption, or is it getting worse?
Thank you very much, Datuk. Let me also be very honest in my answer. I think in certain respects, meaning by which certain aspects of corruption, I think we have improved. We are getting better in fighting corruption. In certain other areas, I think it is getting worse. What do I mean by this? When I look at the awareness in society as a whole today compared to 30, 40 years ago, I organized my first seminar on corruption in 1980, which is a long time ago, 35 years ago, right? 1980. And it was opened by the late Sultan of Perak, who was at that time the Lord President. He was the Chief Justice of Malaysia at that time, Sultan Azlan Shah, way back in 1980. When I compare to 1980, I think we've improved in the sense there's much greater awareness, much greater commitment to fighting corruption today compared to before. And I think in certain areas, there is much greater effort against corruption. For instance, we didn't have special corruption courts before. Today we have 14 special corruption courts in Malaysia. At the same time, you find that we have a Whistleblowers Act, we have a Witness Protection Act. All this is part of the fight against corruption. We also have some other improvements that have taken place. Even if you look at our anti-corruption agency, today it's called the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission. It is autonomous in many respects. It has got 5 oversight panels, which we never had before, and it is able to act in many areas. These are the things which are positive in the fight against corruption. We have the Institute Integrity Malaysia. I'm a member of that institute's board of directors. And you also have an academy for the fight against corruption. So you've got all sorts of institutions. In other words, institution building in the fight against corruption is much better today than before. But I think where we have perhaps become worse, Dato, in response to your question, I think we have become worse in an area known in the fight against corruption. It is known as grand corruption. Grand corruption. Another term for grand corruption is elite corruption. Grand corruption. Elite corruption, we have become worse. We have become worse. I need not elaborate on this. Anyone reading the newspapers the last 6 months knows what I'm talking about. As far as grand corruption is concerned, elite corruption, it has become worse. Let me sort of again put it in very graphic terms. Today we don't have leaders at the helm, people like the late Tun Razak, who as you know, was so concerned about integrity that his own wife could not go to London to see him when he was very ill. He was dying at that time, in January 1976, because there was no provision in the general orders for a wife to go overseas to London. In other words, provision for a ticket, an air ticket, to visit her husband. So in the end, it was his friends who collected money and bought a ticket for her to visit her husband who was dying in London. He was so concerned about separating the private from the public, doing things in the right way according to rules. Or like Tun Dr. Ismail, the Deputy Prime Minister, or a former governor of the central bank, like the late Tun Ismail Ali. We have had individuals of that sort. Even people like the late Tun Tan Siew Sin, who came from a very rich family, but was always known for his simplicity and his humility and his lifestyle, which was very simple. So I think there are great examples from the past. I don't have to say any more. Thank you very much.
Okay, another question, Bahagia Doktor?
Ada masa lagi ya?
Ada.
Assalamualaikum, Doktor. Any more? Just one question from me. People used to link integrity with corporate governance.
No.
Can you just explain the distinction or the difference between the two? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Integrity is an all-embracing concept. It is not just confined to the corporate sector. It is all-embracing. It involves anyone. You need integrity in running a football association. Look at what has happened at the international level. FIFA. Look at Sam Platter. Look at some of the other officials. The corruption involved in FIFA is unbelievable. So this is what I mean when I say that integrity is a general, all-embracing concept. It applies to every area. But corporate governance is specific to corporations. And integrity in relation to corporate governance means following ethics, the rules that are established in doing business. And you will find that if you look at genuine, honest business, the rules are very much linked to ethics. You have to make sure, if you read Peter Drucker, you read all the corporate gurus, the managed gurus, they emphasize values and principles. So those are the values and principles of corporate governance. The way in which you deal with your client, the way in which you deal with the state, because big corporations deal with the state all the while, the way in which you deal with the consumer. It must be based upon ethics. You don't cheat. You don't indulge in fraudulence, which is one of the big issues today in corporations in China. It is the way they deal with consumers. There are big problems. So you have to develop corporate ethics, corporate governance, linked to integrity.
Assalamualaikum, Professor. My name is Dayang Mas Molidiza. I'm from Sarawak Timber Industry Development Corporation. All right, my question is, I read, integrity is doing the right thing without no one is watching. So how do you relate that statement in the context of Sarawak civil service? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I must confess I don't know much about the Sarawak civil service. So I'm in no position to give concrete examples. I really don't know. But as a general proposition, doing something that is right when no one is watching, I think that is true. That's what integrity is. You know that there is no one watching you doing something wrong. Like integrity is not just in relation to corruption. You don't do your work well. You cut corners when you're doing your work. Or you decide to cabut from your office before time is over for that day. You play golf during office hours. If you do things of that sort, yeah. I can sense from your laughter that it's something which you understand. Now, if you do things of that sort, now that's lack of integrity. Even not being punctual, that's also a lack of integrity. So a lack of integrity is in all sorts of areas. Yeah? The way you do your work, it is as basic as that. That is integrity. The way you do your work. With commitment, with dedication, knowing that you have been assigned a task, it doesn't matter. It could be something very, very simple, like keeping the office clean. You're a cleaner. Or you're the tea lady in an office. You have to do your work well. I give the simple examples, but I know that it is far more important when you are holding a very responsible position. You're the head of a division, or you're a director. Your responsibility is greater. And you know that no one knows that you are cutting corners or that you are doing a slipshod job, but you still make sure that what you do is done properly. That's integrity. And it would apply anywhere. You can try to apply it to your own situation. All right? Thank you.
Good morning, Prof. Chandra. I think I was a student in 1980s. So nice to meet you again.
Thank you.
I think you talk about a lot of issues that start from the education, and then you move on to the religious. So I'm not sure, because I think in terms of religious education, I think we went through in the early child, and then go to the university. When things happen after you start working, you come to a certain age like 40s, 30s, then you start involve a lot of corruption. You look at now, a lot of corruption happen among the top leaders, and which is going to be example for the young people, to follow. So I'm not sure. Do you think that we need to revamp the education system? You cannot teach in the university to avoid the corruption. It's too late for them,
Yeah.
So what do you think about it? I think in Malaysia we have a better multicultural in terms of religions, all these. Look at the Sarawak, Sabah, and even Kelantan, we all need. But why? It's happened the late age. What is your alternative solution for this? Otherwise, we keep on talking the issue another 10 years.
Yeah.
There's no problem solving. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We always get this question because it is an important question about education and its link to the fight against corruption. And I think you were referring to both conventional education and religious education. Let me try to separate the two for the purpose of my answer very quickly. I think there is a major problem with religious education. And I'm talking here about Islamic education. It may apply to the other religions too, Christianity and Buddhism and so on. I don't know whether it is organized on the same scale, but since the majority population in Malaysia is Muslim, Malaysia as a whole, and Islamic education has been going on for a long while, I think there is a problem with Islamic education. To put it very briefly, I would say this. At a very tender age, when a child is, let's say, 3 years old, 4 years old, in Taskas, and then your Tadikas, later in primary school and so on, what is it that you should emphasize in bringing up that child? So that those things that you emphasize would be deeply embedded in the child's psychology. According to child psychologists and educationists, they'll tell you that you must be able to put across values in the right way, in an effective way, so that the child will pick up those values. Like kindness. You can transmit this very important value to a little child, kindness, in all sorts of ways. Examples, by telling certain stories and getting them to interact in a certain way, being kind to one another, even though they're little kids. You can do that. So you transmit kindness as a value. This is what is important. But what we are doing today is, if you look at what is happening, and I have a little bit of exposure to this through my granddaughter, one of my 6 grandchildren. I have 2 granddaughters. Now, this granddaughter when I hear some stories related to her experience, I'm quite convinced that what they emphasize are not values, but rituals and practices. Rituals, but not values. There's a difference between the two. How is it that a little 3-year-old child can become very, very concerned about certain aspects of dressing, of attire, like whether the father wears decent shorts covering your knees, or he wears long pants, what sort of attire he wears. That is what the child becomes very concerned about, because that is what is taught in school, in your taska, in your tadika. These are the things that are emphasized. I've heard this from a few friends of mine too, that the emphasis is upon rituals, upon forms, not substance. This is the biggest problem with religious education in Malaysia. The emphasis is on form, not substance. What is important is substance. Substance would be like kindness, love. Develop values like that, love, caring for one another, honesty, clearly linked to integrity, honesty. You can do that at a very young age. Like you take something, you put it back. You give back to some other person. You don't steal, because even very young children can steal. They can steal. I mean, not consciously. They steal because it is just something that they do. Now, these are things that we can correct through the emphasis upon substance. And substance means values. We don't do that. This, I think, is our failure. Let me also say this, that in the early period, if you look at our religious education going back to 40, 50, 60 years ago, there was more emphasis upon substance and less upon form. Today, there's more emphasis upon form, much less upon substance, which is why we are in this dilemma. If you look at conventional education, here again, well, Islamic education in primary and secondary schools. I've looked at some books because we were involved, Yayasan One Malaysia, at one time in looking at the curriculum. And here again, I was amazed how much emphasis there is upon form and how little emphasis there is upon substance. Actual values, actual principles. We don't emphasize this. So it is basically this obsession with form rather than substance, which is our problem. A friend of mine in Indonesia, he has distinguished between these two by saying this is the distinction between Islam kulit dan Islam isi. Between kulit and isi. Yeah? It is kulit that we are obsessed with, not the isi. Which is why we are so obsessed with labels. Islamic State. But look at the content. Look at the actual practices. Which is why, you know, when they try to do a Sharia index done by an Islamic scholar by the name of Imam Faisal Rauf, when he did this Sharia index and tried to evaluate different countries in the world based upon their actual practices like honesty, integrity, transparency, good governance, values of that sort, he found that the top 20 countries were all non-Muslim countries, based upon principles that are Islamic, like honesty and integrity and so on. Countries like Sweden, Finland, Denmark, they've done much better than other Muslim majority countries, whether it is Egypt or Algeria or Saudi Arabia or countries of that sort. Why? Because in these countries we emphasize, so-called Muslim majority countries, we emphasize the form, not the substance. The substance is what counts. So we have to bring about a change in the thinking of Muslims vis-a-vis their religion. And then we will have a change in the education system, in the content and in the curriculum. This is what we have to work towards. And even when it comes to moral studies, if I may say this very briefly, I think it is so important to provide real, tangible examples and show by examples that you are emphasizing what really matters in life. We are not doing that. It is just, memorizing a few things and learning a few things by heart, but this is not enough to bring about the change that we want. Yes, education is part of the problem.
Okay. Terima kasih Bahagia Dr. Chandra Muzaffar atas ceramah integriti itu tadi.